Before we delve into this gripping narrative, please share in the comments where you're tuning in from to experience this poignant tale. The girl who walked into the police station. It was an unusually quiet evening at the precinct. The kind of silence that made officers uneasy, as if something was brewing beneath the surface. The fluorescent lights flickered slightly, casting long shadows over the desks cluttered with paperwork, half-empty coffee cups, and scattered reports. Officer James Carter was just about to take a sip of his now-cold coffee when the front door slammed open. A girl, no older than 16, staggered in. Her face was streaked with tears, her clothes slightly torn, and her hands trembling as she clutched the edges of her oversized hoodie. She wasn't just crying. She was gasping for air, sobbing so violently it seemed like the words were caught in her throat. James put his cup down and rushed toward her. Hey, slow down. Are you hurt?" His voice was calm but firm, his instincts kicking in immediately. The girl barely managed to shake her head, her breath coming in sharp, broken gasps. She paused, clutching at her chest, as if her heart might burst. "They're coming." James exchanged a quick glance with Officer Riley, who had also rushed over. Riley, a seasoned officer with a face hardened by years of service, crouched to the girl's eye level. "Who's coming, sweetheart?" she asked gently. The girl gulped, struggling to form the words. Then, finally, she whispered, "The men. They have my brother." That was all James needed to hear. "Get her some water," he instructed Riley, before turning to another officer. "Pull up any missing persons reports in the last 24 hours. The girl took the cup of water with shaking hands, but barely drank. Instead, she gripped James's sleeve. "You have to help him," she pleaded. "They took him. They'll kill him." James crouched down, steadying her with both hands on her shoulders. "We will, I promise. But I need you to tell me everything. Start from the beginning." She took a shuddering breath and nodded. Her name was Mia, and she and her younger brother, Ethan, had been on their way home from a friend's house when a van pulled up beside them. They stopped, and these men, they jumped out. I ran, but they grabbed Ethan. Her voice cracked. "I tried to fight them, I did, but one of them hit me. Hard. I don't even know how I got away." James felt his jaw tighten. "Did you see their faces? Anything about the van? License plate? Color?" She hesitated, then shook her head. "It was dark. And fast. But I remember. There was a sticker on the back. Something red, like a symbol." James stood up and turned to Riley. "Check surveillance cameras near that street. And pull up all vehicles with a red symbol decal in the system." As the officers moved into action, James crouched back down. "Mia, we'll find him. But I need you to trust us, okay?" She nodded, wiping her tears with the sleeve of her hoodie. And in that moment, James saw it, the flicker of something deeper in her eyes. Not just fear, not just desperation. Hope. The search begins. Mia sat on the metal chair in the police station's waiting area, hugging her knees to her chest. The blanket an officer had draped over her shoulders was warm, but she still felt cold inside. The weight of what had happened pressed down on her, making her feel like she couldn't breathe properly. Every time she closed her eyes, she saw Ethan's face, his scared, confused expression, as the men dragged him away. James Carter stood at his desk, staring at the computer screen. The security footage from the area was grainy, but they had found something. A black van with tinted windows, speeding away from the intersection where Mia had last seen her brother. He paused the footage and leaned in. There, on the rear windshield was a faded red sticker, shaped like a dragon curled around itself. It was distinctive. James grabbed the phone and dialed the department's vehicle records unit. "I need a list of registered vehicles matching a black van with a red dragon decal. Run it against any known criminal activity in the last 5 years." Riley, standing nearby, folded her arms. "You thinking this might be more than just a random kidnapping?" James exhaled sharply. Something about this doesn't feel right. If it was just some lowlife grabbing a kid for ransom, they wouldn't have left a trail, and they wouldn't have let Mia get away. Riley nodded. So either they were sloppy, or they weren't worried about being caught. That thought sent a chill down James' spine. He turned back to Mia, who was sitting quietly now, staring at the floor. He walked over, crouching beside her. "Mia, I need you to think carefully. Anything about these men? How they moved? How they sounded? Did they say anything?" She hesitated. They spoke to each other in another language. Not Spanish, but something else. James exchanged a glance with Riley. "Eastern European." Mia nodded. "Maybe." And one of them had a tattoo on his hand. A black snake, I think, wrapping around his wrist. James stood up. "That helps. Stay here, okay?" He returned to his desk, pulling up the database of known gang affiliations. Within minutes, he found what he was looking for. The Red Vipers, he muttered under his breath. A violent gang known for human trafficking and illegal dealings. They had been on the police radar for years, but no solid evidence had ever linked them to recent crimes. Until now. Riley's jaw tightened. "You think they took Ethan for trafficking?" James didn't answer. He didn't have to. They both knew what the odds were if they didn't act fast. Mia suddenly stood up. "I want to help. I can help." James shook his head. "No, you need to stay safe. We'll handle this." But Mia's hands clenched into fists. "I know you mean well, but this is my brother. I can't just sit here and do nothing." Riley sighed. "She's got a point, James. If she remembers anything else, it might help us find him faster." James rubbed his temples. He hated putting a civilian, especially a teenage girl, at risk. But time was running out, and he needed every advantage he could get. "All right," he finally said, "but you stay with us at all times. No wandering, no taking risks." "Understood." Mia nodded, her face determined. "Understood." With that, James grabbed his badge and gun. "Let's move." The search had begun, and they weren't stopping until they found Ethan. Into the shadows. The sound of tires screeching against wet asphalt echoed through the empty streets as Officer James Carter drove through the dimly lit roads, his grip firm on the steering wheel. The city had a different face at night, one that was unkind to those who wandered alone, especially kids like Ethan. Mia sat in the back seat, her fists clenched so tightly that her knuckles had turned white. Every time she blinked, she saw her little brother's face, his wide, terrified eyes as the van doors slammed shut. Her heart ached, and her chest burned with helplessness. She had to do something. "Where are we going first?" she asked, her voice barely above a whisper. James kept his eyes on the road. "We traced some known Red Viper locations. There are a few abandoned warehouses near the docks, places they've been known to operate from in the past. If they've taken Ethan, that's where we start looking." Riley, sitting in the passenger seat, pulled out her phone. "We also have officers checking cameras along the main roads. If that van's still in the city, we'll find it." Mia bit her lip. What if they've already left? James didn't answer immediately. He didn't want to lie to her, but he also couldn't afford to let her panic. "Then we'll keep looking," he said finally. "We don't stop until we find him." Mia swallowed hard and nodded. The car came to a slow stop near the old docks. The air smelled of salt and rust, and the only sounds were the distant crashing of waves and the hum of a flickering streetlight. James turned to Mia. "You stay in the car." "No," she said immediately. James sighed. "Mia, I can help," she interrupted. "I know my brother's voice. If he's in there, I'll hear him." James looked at Riley, who gave him a look that said, "She's got a point." "Fine," he relented, "but you don't leave my side. Not even for a second." Mia nodded, pushing open the door and stepping out into the cold night air. The warehouse loomed ahead, dark and silent. the kind of silence that felt wrong. James and Riley moved cautiously, their hands resting on their holstered guns. Mia followed closely behind, her heart pounding. Then she heard it. A muffled sound. Faint, but distinct. A voice. Ethan. Mia's breath caught in her throat. "I hear him," she whispered. James signaled for silence, then moved toward the side entrance of the warehouse. The door was slightly ajar. He exchanged a glance with Riley before pushing it open. Inside, the warehouse was nearly pitch black, save for a single hanging light in the distance. The faint sound of chains rattling sent a chill down Mia's spine. Then she saw them. A group of men standing near a chair, where Ethan was tied up. His small body shook as he whimpered, his face streaked with tears. Mia's heart nearly stopped. James raised his gun. "Police." Hands in the air. The men spun around, their eyes flashing with surprise, then anger. One of them reached for something at his side. "Don't even think about it," Riley warned, her gun aimed steadily. Mia barely noticed the standoff. Her eyes were locked on her brother. She wanted to run to him, to untie him, to hold him, but she forced herself to stay still. One of the men smirked. "You shouldn't have come here, officer." Before James could react, the lights suddenly shut off, plunging them into darkness. And then, chaos. The fight for freedom. The world went black. For a split second, all Mia could hear was the sound of her own breathing. Shallow, panicked gasps as her heart pounded against her ribs. Then, the warehouse exploded into chaos. A loud crash echoed through the space, followed by the rapid shuffling of feet and the unmistakable sound of a struggle. A gunshot rang out, sharp and deafening, making Mia flinch. She couldn't see a thing. Fear clawed at her chest. Then, a voice. "James, stay down," he barked. Mia dropped to the floor instinctively, her hands gripping the cold concrete. She could hear the scuffle of boots, grunts of pain, and the sound of bodies slamming into metal. Somewhere in the darkness, Ethan whimpered. "Ethan," she called out, desperation in her voice. "Mia." His voice was weak but alive. He was alive. James and Riley were fighting. She could tell. She heard fists connecting with flesh, a man groaning in pain, the clatter of something heavy being knocked over. The darkness made it impossible to see, and Mia's pulse roared in her ears. She had to do something. Her hands scrambled across the floor, searching for anything that could help. Her fingers brushed against a long metal pipe. Without thinking, she gripped it and pushed herself up, her eyes adjusting slightly to the faint glow coming through the broken warehouse windows. A shadow moved toward her. A man. One of them. Mia didn't wait. She swung the pipe with all her strength. It connected. Hard. The man let out a sharp grunt and staggered back, clutching his arm. Mia didn't stop. She swung again, this time hitting his knee. He collapsed with a yell, and she scrambled past him toward the direction of her brother's voice. Ethan was tied to a chair, his small hands bound with thick rope. His face was pale, streaked with tears. Mia dropped to her knees beside him, fumbling with the knots. "It's okay," she whispered. "I've got you." The ropes were tight. Too tight. Her fingers were shaking as she tried to loosen them. A movement behind her. A figure rising. Mia turned just as the man she had hit started to get up. His face twisted in fury. She braced herself, but before he could reach her, there was a loud thud, and he crumpled to the ground. James stood behind him, breathing heavily, his gun raised. His face was partially illuminated by the faint light, his eyes sharp and focused. "You okay?" he asked, his voice tight with urgency. Mia nodded, breathless. "Help me with Ethan." James knelt beside them and used his knife to cut the ropes. Ethan collapsed into Mia's arms, shaking violently. She hugged him tight, tears slipping down her cheeks. "It's okay," she whispered. "You're safe now." The fight behind them was ending. Riley had one of the men pinned to the ground, cuffing him as he groaned in pain. 2 others lay motionless nearby. The warehouse reeked of sweat and blood. The Red Vipers weren't getting away this time. James stood up, his voice firm as he spoke into his radio. Suspects apprehended. Send backup to the docks. We have the boy. A pause. Then the response. Copy that. Units en route. Mia clung to Ethan, her entire body trembling. She could feel his little hands gripping her back, his breath warm against her shoulder. James crouched beside them, his voice softer now. You did good, Mia. She swallowed hard, meeting his gaze. I couldn't lose him. James gave her a small nod. You didn't. You saved him. As the distant sound of sirens filled the air, Maya finally allowed herself to breathe. The nightmare was over. Or at least she hoped it was. A new beginning. The sirens grew louder, filling the night with their high-pitched wail. Red and blue lights flashed through the shattered warehouse windows, casting eerie shadows over the scene. The nightmare had ended, but the weight of everything that had happened still pressed heavily on Mia's chest. She held Ethan tightly, her fingers running through his messy hair, as if reassuring herself that he was really here, that he was alive. His small hands clutched at her hoodie, his body still trembling from the terror he had endured. James stood nearby, watching as backup officers swarmed in, cuffing the remaining gang members and securing the area. He exchanged a silent nod with Riley, who was busy giving statements to the arriving detectives. Then, James turned back to Mia. You did something tonight that most people wouldn't have the courage to do, he said, crouching beside her. His voice was steady, yet there was a warmth in it that Mia hadn't expected. You never gave up. You fought for your brother. Mia swallowed hard, her throat burning. I was so scared, she admitted. James nodded. Bravery isn't about not being scared. It's about what you do despite the fear. She looked down at Ethan, his face still buried in her shoulder. I thought I lost him, she whispered. I didn't know if I'd ever see him again. James sighed, running a hand through his hair. Most kids in this situation wouldn't have made it to the station. They would have given up, waited for someone else to fix it. But you fought. And because of that, Ethan's here. Mia exhaled shakily. It still didn't feel real. Just hours ago, she had been running through the streets, her lungs burning, her mind screaming that she had already lost him. But now she could feel his heartbeat against hers. She looked up at James, her eyes filled with something deeper than gratitude. Thank you, she whispered. James shook his head. Don't thank me. You're the reason we found him. A paramedic knelt beside them, checking Ethan for injuries. He was shaken, exhausted, but physically unharmed. Maya refused to let go of his hand as they were guided to an ambulance. James and Riley watched as they disappeared into the flashing lights. You think she'll be okay? Riley asked quietly. James exhaled, crossing his arms. She's got more strength in her than she realizes. She'll be more than okay. Days later, the world didn't stop. Life kept moving. The headlines ran stories about the Red Viper gang's takedown, about a young girl who had risked everything to save her little brother. Some called her a hero. Others said she was reckless. Mia didn't care what the world thought. All that mattered was that Ethan was home, safe. She sat beside him on their apartment balcony, watching as the sun dipped below the horizon, painting the sky in hues of gold and crimson. Ethan leaned against her, his head resting on her shoulder. You're my hero, Mia, he murmured sleepily. She smiled, pressing a kiss to his hair. No, she whispered. We saved each other. Somewhere in the city, James sat in his office, flipping through his notes. One case closed, but he knew Maya's story wasn't just about what had happened in that warehouse. It was about resilience, about fighting for the people you love, even when the world tells you it's hopeless. And as he closed the file, he knew one thing for sure. Mia wasn't just a survivor. She was a warrior. A girl who had walked into a police station crying and walked out a legend.